Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another video. Well, today we have gone really down the rabbit hole. Today we are talking about the highly, what's a good word for this? Highly controversial release of the Razer Cobra. Now, this is going to be the wired version of the Razer Cobra. I did not bother to get the wireless version of the Razer Cobra because it is 179 Canadian dollars, and the mouse with those specs for that price is quite frankly insane. So today we'll just be talking about the Razer Cobra wired edition, but there's a lot to talk about here, so I just want to dive right in and get started on this. Just a quick little disclaimer, this product was not provided by Razer, nor has Razer sponsored this video in any way, shape, or form. By the end of this video, you're going to see why. And as always, I will have timestamps down in the description if you are looking for a specific topic. Alright, let's start with pricing. So as I mentioned before, there are two versions of the Razer Cobra. There's the Razer Cobra Pro, which is 179 Canadian dollars, and then there is the Razer Cobra Wired Edition, which is coming in at around 54.99 Canadian dollars, a much more reasonable price in my opinion. The unboxing is very simple, kind of similar to how the Death Adder V3 was packaged, just very basic. This one does not come with a bag though, however, and it does not come with grip tape or any other accessories. The only quote-unquote accessory I guess you can say it comes with is a cable tie and a USB-A cover for the mouse itself. So I'm going to be comparing this directly to the dimensions of the Razer Viper Mini, which is what this mouse is quote-unquote replacing. So the Razer Cobra is coming in at a length of 119.6 millimeters, a width of 62.5 millimeters, and a height of 38.1 millimeters, whereas the Viper Mini came in at a length of 118.3 millimeters, a width of 61.4 millimeters, and a height of 38.3 millimeters. So overall, not a huge change in dimensions. It's more of just the actual shape of the shell itself that has changed the most. Another area there's been slight changes in weight. Now the Razer Cobra comes in at 58 grams and the Viper Mini weighed around 61 grams, so there's a little bit of a weight difference there. In terms of the overall balancing of the unit, the balancing is actually surprisingly top heavy. I didn't really think this was going to be because of the cable, because a lot of the other wired mice I've looked at, like the HyperX Pulsar Haze 2, didn't really have a lot of top heaviness because of the cable, but for some reason the Cobra is quite top heavy. A bit of an odd thing there. I think it's just because a lot of the PCB is more towards the front of the mouse than it is the back, but that's something to note if you are someone who is a little more sensitive to weight balancing on some mice. That is something to note about the Razer Cobra wired edition. Now in terms of the shell, this is going to be again very similar to the Viper Mini, so it is going to be a right-handed symmetrical mouse that's going to be made of plastic. In terms of QC, Death Grip didn't show any kind of areas of weakness, any kind of flexing or creaking. Even during a shake test and like hard rattling the mouse, I had no issues with any kind of rattling or anything like that. Overall, the QC was surprisingly very good. So the coating is this semi-rough texture in the areas where you're going to make contact. So again, the base of the mouse, the main clicks, and the sides are going to be this semi-rough texture, and then the areas where you're not going to be making contact is kind of this recessed glossy kind of texture. Bit of an odd choice there. I'm not sure why they didn't make like a solid shell design, but it is what it is. Now when it comes to grippiness, normally with some coatings that are good for dry hands, bad for wet hands, or they're good for wet hands or they're bad for dry hands, but somehow the coating on the Razer Cobra is bad for both. It has like zero gripability. The only coating I've used in my time as a peripheral reviewer that reminds me of this coating is the Death Adder V3 Pro, which had a lot of issues with its just very slippery coating. So unfortunately, we're seeing a very similar situation here. Overall grippiness is as a whole is just really bad. You will need grip tape on this unit 100%, and that is something that I kind of am questioning Razer here, because the Death Adder V3 Pro did come with grip tape. While it wasn't great, it was better than nothing, but the Razer Cobra doesn't come with any grip tape, so you're stuck with this mouse you can barely hold on to. I remember when I was streaming and testing this out at first, I literally called this thing like a Razer branded ice cube because it was so hard to grip with my hands, which is very frustrating. But I highly recommend you get grips on this. If you do decide to go with this mouse, it is going to be required. I use the X-ray pad grips in this one for the time of my review, and they were a godsend to actually make me able to hold this mouse. So again, this is designed to replace the Viper Mini lineup, so it's going to be the kind of one-size-fits-all-esque situation. However, due to the coating being so poor, I'm going to give you like a rough outline of what grips would probably fit this, but keep in mind, depending on your hand, there's probably going to be some grip issues, so you will most likely need grip tape specifically for fingertip. Large hands, fingertip, very aggressive aggro claw were the only ones I was able to do on this one. It's way too small for me to palm, obviously. Medium hands, fingertip, claw, palm, again, depending on your grip, and small hands are going to be palm and claw. Again, I'd highly recommend you using grip tape for any of these grips because this thing is very hard to hold. All right, and I wanted to make a quick little note here about the skates. The skates are just your bog standard Razer dock skates. There's nothing really fancy, but not really a lot to say. They are rounded out of the box. There's working period is pretty low depending on the hardness of your pad. I didn't run into any issues of where I felt the skates were fighting my movement or they were incompatible with the pad. Overall, it felt completely fine. Nothing to complain about in my opinion. One other quick note about the cable for the Razer Cobra. On the website and all the advertising and the box and stuff, it says that this is a Razer SpeedFlex cable. However, this does not feel like a Razer SpeedFlex cable because it does not feel the same as the cable on the Death Adder V3 wired edition, which is very odd. The outer coating seems to be rougher. I'm not really sure what they did to the coating, but it definitely has significantly more friction on the mouse pad than the one on my Death Adder V3 does. So that is something to know if you're using a rougher pad like a control pad or a softer pad and you're not using a mouse bungee, which I highly recommend regardless, you may run into some issues with cable drag on this just because it does tend to stick to those surfaces a little more than other Razer cables do. And in terms of flexibility and rigidity, I did notice this cable had a lot more rigidity than the cable found on the Razer Death Adder V3. Again, just I'm not really sure why. I think it's just a bit of a harder cable. But in terms of compatibility with bungees and that kind of stuff, it was compatible with my kind of standard bungee, and it also was compatible with the Pulsar ES bungee as well, so no problems with bungee compatibility there. Now let's move on to one of the more confusing areas of the Razer Cobra, and that is going to be the main clicks. Now on the box and all the advertisements, it says that these are Razer Gen 3 optical switches. However, they do not feel like Razer Gen 3 optical switches. There is ever so slight pre-travel and a fair amount of post-travel on the main clicks here. There's no wobble aside from if you put your fingers at the top of the clicks and pull outward, similar to what we found on the Keychron M3, but nothing that's going to affect the actual in-game performance. The click feeling is definitely heavier than the ones found on the Death Adder V3. I found them to actually be very similar to the 1.0 micro switches found on my Keychron M3 Mini here. They definitely feel a little weird because, again, on the advertising it says it's the same click and it's not, so it does take a little bit of time to get used to the new click feeling. They are still fairly spammable. I never really ran into an issue during my testing where I felt like I wasn't clicking fast enough, but just a bit of a period to get used to the clicks. I remember when I did my unboxing for the Cobra on stream, I think the first thing I said about the clicks is that they kind of felt hollow, which is I still maintained even after all my testing. I never really got used to the weird hollowness of the clicks. It just overall just felt really strange. Even though that the Razer Death Adder V3 and the Cobra share the same clicks, I found that the Death Adder V3's clicks were significantly more FPS oriented just as the lower actuation, whereas the Cobra's felt a little heavier, so it definitely took a little longer to get used to, but I just prefer the switches on the Death Adder V3 over the ones on the Cobra. All right, now let's talk about the side switches. Now the side switches are going to be pretty much the identical story to the main switches. Again, being the same switch type, they're going to have the same issues. So the same weirdly hollow kind of clicks, some pre-travel, a little bit of post-travel, overall just kind of feeling hollow. One odd thing though about the side buttons was that they feel almost like overly tensioned, if that makes sense, because it feels like you have to press them down so hard to make them actuate. I don't know why it's so hard to, like, because once you actuate the click, then it becomes easy, but it's like they have to push with 40 grams of force to hit the actuation point. Then once you hit the actuation point, it goes down to like 10 grams. I don't know why that is. Obviously, that's not the correct gram amount. I'm just using this for an example, but it definitely feels a little weird. I will say they're definitely significantly less spammable than other side clicks I've used, drawing contrast to the Keychron M3 Mini. Even the Wano side buttons on those ones felt significantly more spammable. I think it's more of just a tensioning issue overall than anything, but again, just a really weird thing with the side buttons I noticed on the Razer Cobra. And keeping in line with weirdness, we're going to talk about the scroll wheel now. Now, the scroll wheel itself in terms of scrolling is fine. It's definitely a very light scroll. It's not a free scrolling lightness, but it definitely is light for sure. The actual tactile hump whenever you reach a scroll point is very minimal. If you are using this for FPSs, you would definitely take a little while to get used to the actual scrolling of this one, because I tried it just to switch weapons and that kind of stuff, and I was over scrolling like crazy. So in terms of FPS usage, I can't really recommend the scroll wheel for that. For general use, the scroll wheel was fine. My biggest issue with the scroll wheel was the click of the scroll wheel. Now, again, I'm not someone who uses the middle click for the mouse button pretty much ever. However, people who do it for like toggle mute on Discord and that kind of stuff will probably have issues, because similarly to how these side buttons felt, the mouse wheel middle click just feels like weirdly hollow, overly tensioned. It just feels really bad, and it's really loud as well. It just overall, it just feels really bad, unfortunately. In terms of just like day-to-day use, the scroll wheel felt fine. It definitely did take a little bit of an adjustment just to get used to the very like loose scroll and the very minimal tactile scrolling hump. But in terms of gaming performance, this is not the scroll wheel you want, especially if you rely on the scroll wheel or the mouse wheel middle click for anything. I would highly recommend not using this mouse for that, because you will definitely have issues with it in the future. Keeping in vein with the Razer Cobra's switches and buttons just making absolutely zero sense, we have the DPI button here. Now, the DPI button obviously is set to change your DPI, but you can rebind it in the Razer Synapse software, which is nice, but the button feels like absolute garbage. Just like the HyperX Haste 2, where the DPI button just felt garbage, it's exactly the same here. It just feels really mushy, really bad, which is funny compared to all the other buttons on the mouse feel really overly tensioned and almost too hard to push down. This one feels like you're just pushing in like a jello cap or something. Very confusing. Again, I don't touch the DPI button ever, because most of the time the DPI buttons are not that great, but if you do end up using it for changing sensitivities, that kind of stuff, it is something to note, or switching profiles, you may have a bit of an issue with it in terms of usage. Alrighty, now let's talk about the sensor. Now, this sensor is a Razer 8500K DPI sensor. It has an IPS of 300, an acceleration of 35 grams, and the positioning of the shell is a centered, so no kind of weird off-center design. DPI ranges from 200 to 8500, and it does have 50 DPI steps for changing it, which I noticed was a little odd. Traditionally, it's a little higher than that. Normally around 100 you see for DPI steps, but for some reason this one's 50. There is also no ripple, angle snapping, or motion sync available on this. Now, unfortunately, I do not have the tools to accurately test the response rate or the DPI deviation available in the sensor, but I'm just going to go off feel here. In terms of latency, I didn't really notice any problems comparable to everything else I've used. I didn't have any crazy experiences where it felt like I was like clicks were delayed or anything like that. But again, I don't have the actual data to back that up, so I'm just going over personal experience. And in terms of DPI deviation, I will say that this is significantly faster than the 3395 I have on my Keychron M3 and M3 Mini. There was a huge difference there. The reason why I'm using the Keychron M3 and the M3 Mini as my baseline is because that is the mouse I use the most, because I use my M3 and my M3 Mini for work all the time, so I'm very used to the actual feeling of that mouse. And just compared to those, it did feel significantly faster. I tested the Razer Cobra at 800 DPI, 45 centimeter per 660, and there was a big difference in speed going from the M3 to the Cobra. I would probably say, if I had to guesstimate the difference, I would probably say it's like a 5 centimeter difference, give or take. But again, that's my personal experience. It feels more like you're playing on 40 centimeter as opposed to 45 centimeters. Now, some of you may have noticed I didn't talk about LOD yet, and there's a reason for that. I'm actually gonna be talking about the LOD in its own dedicated section a little later, just because there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the LOD on that sensor, but I wanted to cover everything else first before we got into that. Alrighty, and on to onboard memory and software control. Now, the Razer Cobra does support one onboard profile for saving binds, so custom key binds, your presets on your mouse itself, your DPI, all that kind of stuff is set. All of that is managed by the Razer Synapse software. Now, again, a lot of you will know I'm not the biggest fan of Razer Synapse because I think it's kind of just bloated for what it is, but in terms of the Razer Cobra, since it does have the one onboard memory profile, you can just open Synapse one time, flash all your settings to it, and then you never have to touch Synapse again, which is nice to see. One thing I did have a bit of a problem with, though, is that for some reason, my Razer Cobra would constantly reset its onboard memory whenever the mouse was turned off. Whenever you plug the mouse in and you turn your PC off and the mouse is still plugged into a powered device, it will keep its profiles. But if you unplug the mouse or turn off the power to a USB port, it will completely lose all of its stuff. Now, I reset the mouse, I did a bunch of troubleshooting stuff according to Razer's website, and I was not able to fix this issue. Now, I do not know if this is going to be an issue on all of the mice. I don't know if it's an issue with the profiles not saving properly. I have no idea what the problem is, but every single time I wanted to switch my mouse and I turned off one of my USB hubs and I turned on the other one for the Cobra and I went to go use it, I had to reset everything, which was a little annoying. I will say, once I opened Synapse, it did reflash everything automatically, so it didn't have to redo all my keybinds and stuff every single time. It was more of just like the mouse forgets it has something on it. It very well could be that I just have a bad capacitor on my unit. It's not saving the profile correctly, so I'm not sure if this is isolated to just me or if this is all the Razer Cobras. If you have used the Razer Cobra and have had this similar issue, please let me know in the comments, because I'd love to see everyone else's experience with this. But aside from that weird issue with the memory management, I will say overall it was fine. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of snaps, but again, just the mouse worked fine. I really didn't have any issues aside of it just forgetting profiles when I unplugged it. Alrighty, now let's talk about the big one for this mouse. So we're going to talk about the LOD issue. So the biggest flaw of the Razer Cobra is the LOD. So I ran into several instances where the mouse would just stop tracking mid-movement for absolutely no reason. I figured that maybe just because I'm used to ergo mice, maybe I was tilting the mouse so much and it was causing the sensor to lose track. But when I did the same movements on other mice, I did not have a problem. I don't know what it is about this Razer 8500 DPI sensor they used for the Razer Cobra, but it just has really weird issues in terms of the LOD management. When I went to the Razer Synapse software to go change the LOD software, I noticed that there was not an option to change the LOD, which was a little shocking at first. And then I went to the here and I was like, okay, well, a calibration. So there's a bunch of options and it says add a surface. I'm like, okay, cool. So I'll just add a surface. So I go here and I open the list and it's a bunch of Razer mouse pads. I'm like, okay, cool. Where's the custom mouse pad? Where's the custom mouse pad option, Razer? Where is it? It was here before and it's not here now. They removed the option to add a custom surface. So instead, I had to guesstimate what my mouse pad was closest to in order to use my calibration. Now, I don't know if if it's just a placeholder image for what the mouse pad is. I don't know if it actually makes a difference, because you can't set the LOD unless you select a mouse pad. So I don't know if it actually makes a difference in terms of the different pads, if there's an actual change between them. I ended up settling on the Razer Strider because it was similar to what I was using at the time. And I was like, okay, cool. I can set the LOD management from here, but the LOD management from here is not a scale of, it's not 1 millimeter to 2 millimeter or on the Razer Death Adder V3 where it's low, medium, high. It's a scale of 1 to 10, which just made this whole thing even more frustrating. I'm like, okay, great, here we go. So now I'm stuck with a possible setting on my mouse that's controlled by a mouse pad that I don't physically own because I can't use my own surface. And I have a 1 to 10 scale to kind of figure out what the hell that means in terms of a 1 millimeter to 2 millimeter LOD. So I went and I grabbed a bunch of mice, my Razer Death Adder V3 included, with I had them set all to the lowest possible LOD, which is 1 millimeter on all of them. And I went and I manually tested them by hand between the Razer Cobra and all my other mice with different 1mm LODs. And it was incredibly frustrating because this 1 to 10 scale that Razer has for these LOD managements was super frustrating because it was either the LOD was too high and it was tracking inaccurately, or it was too low and it wasn't tracking in the right situations. At the end of the day, I settled on the Razer Strider setting and I set it at around 6, and that seemed to be the best worst option, I guess. Now, the worst part about this is that this is a mouse from 2023. I have a Girl Gear gaming mouse from 2005. And this mouse has an OM02 optical sensor with a 400 DPI, a polling rate of 125 Hz, and an IPS of 16. This optical sensor, which is from like 2005, has better LOD than the Razer Cobra does. By default, even after configuring it with the Razer Synapse software and trying to figure out this whole calibration bullshit from Razer, it still had better LOD. It doesn't even have customizable LOD. It's literally a optical sensor with one preset. A mouse from 2005 has better LOD management than a mouse from 2023, which is insane to me. And the worst part about this is that this mouse is designed to be the most consumer RGB mouse you ever see. If you're a grandma looking to buy her son who likes Roblox a mouse for Christmas, and you go to Walmart and you see this thing shining like the North Pole on a shelf somewhere, this is the mouse you're going to buy because people think, oh, it's pretty, it has a lot of lights, it's probably a good mouse. Why the would you put a mouse like this, aim it at consumers, and have the worst LOD management I have ever seen in my life? Like, I'm an enthusiast and I understand this mouse is not made for me, but if I was a consumer who bought this mouse for my son or grandson and he was having all these problems and I didn't know, oh, well, the LOD management is done by this, I have another mouse to compare it to with this proper LOD, I don't know what this mouse pad is, I know this mouse pad is similar to this mouse pad, I know all this stuff. Consumers don't know this stuff. And I can imagine how frustrating it would be for a consumer to try and fix this issue. The way the Razer is kind of pushing this is that, oh, well, you're not using a Razer mouse pad, so the problem is the mouse pad, not the dog sensor we put in this mouse and the overcomplicated software we use to set your LOD management. If this mouse just had a configuration for 1mm and 2mm LOD, we would not be having this conversation. But this is a consumer mouse. This is designed for consumers, and you make it so hard to do the simplest thing. Why should I have to spend like 3 hours of my time researching and trying to figure out how this thing works when it's supposed to be a plug and play gaming mouse? On Razer's branding, this is a new sensor. This is not the reused sensor from the original Razer Viper. This is a new sensor. So they intentionally kept in this dog LOD management from the sensor. Why would you do that? It makes no sense. I understand the price point of this mouse is supposed to be aimed at a consumer, but the Death Adder V3 wired is only like $20 more than this mouse, and that has a Focus Pro 30K. Why would you not put a Focus Pro 30K sensor in here and get rid of this dog sensor? Like, why would you intentionally put in a bad sensor into this mouse? It makes no sense. I decided, okay, well, you know what? Again, I'm an enthusiast, so this isn't necessarily a problem for me. I'm going to see how this would be for a consumer. So I went ahead and I took time and I contacted Razer support and I told them, hey, I bought my son this mouse and he's having problems with it not tracking properly. And I had 2 separate Razer reps tell me the problem was because I'm not using a Razer mouse pad. When I tell you, when I saw these chats, I'll show the one on the screen right here. When I saw this, I literally lost my mind. I was able to troubleshoot this myself. I know this is not a defective unit. I know this is not a defective sensor. I know it's just a bad sensor implementation. That's all it is. That's all it is. But Razer and their support team are saying it's because you don't have a Razer mouse pad, you need to buy a Razer mouse pad to fix this issue. And it was 2 separate people, which is insane. Like, I thought like, okay, maybe it's just one support person just doesn't give a shit about the issue and they just want to get me out of the chat. So I contacted the other one, they said the same thing. And then when they escalated it to level 2 support, whatever the hell they have there, they wanted me to ship them the mouse to diagnose the issue, which is mind-blowing because again, it's not an issue with the mouse. The mouse is not defective. It's a bad LOD management. And when I explained to them via the chat, I was like, yeah, we went to the calibration page and we don't see an option for a mouse pad because we have I just told them my son has a basic standard Amazon mouse pad. And they're like, oh, okay, well, yeah, well, it's not going to work properly unless you have a Razer mouse pad. And both of them said that. Even the person who then relayed me to higher level support said the same thing. So if you already know the problem, which is complete bullshit, This is not a consumer's problem. This is not a problem on the consumer where they're not buying the right products. This is like, I almost said Apple. It's literally Apple. This is Razer intentionally putting a bad product in a consumer grade mouse in order to drive more sales, which is just so frustrating because, again, not all of Razer's mice are like this. The Death Adder V3 does not have this problem. The Death Adder V3 is in the same price range. I don't understand why they're doing this. And the best part about this whole thing is that even if support tells a consumer who buys this mouse, yeah, it's because you don't have a Razer branded mousepad, you need to go buy a Razer branded mousepad. And they go to their local Best Buy or Walmart and they buy a Giganticus or a Razer Strider. They're still going to have the same problem because the sensor LOD is not proper. It doesn't work properly. Like, it's so frustrating. They're intentionally creating an issue and saying, oh, just buy more of our products to fix the problem. Like, that's all they're doing. It's mind-numbing how stupid this is. Razer said that the Razer Viper was killed off because it did not have good consumer sales, because it was more of it was higher sales an enthusiast product instead of consumers. So they want the Cobra to be a consumer brand mouse. So what do consumers like? Consumers like bright light. Your 8-year-old son who loves Roblox doesn't care what kind of clicks this has, what the build quality is, what kind of sensor it has. He likes bright lights. And that's what Razer did here. So instead of Razer saying, hey, let's put in a Focus Pro 30K sensor in here to make sure that this is a usable mouse for our consumers, they put in RGB instead of a Focus Pro 30K. And of course, there's definitely a price difference between them putting in some LEDs on the board and putting an entirely different sensor. I totally understand that. But that's the thing. This is not something that you decide at the end of the day. This is something you decide at the beginning of you making a new mouse. So they said, well, the Viper was too popular with enthusiasts because it was a good product, so we're going to neuter the product, add RGB, and release it as a new mouse and cater it directly to baseline consumers. I hear you guys in the comments already, oh, well, mel0n, what about the Razer Cobra Pro? Because it has a 30K sensor in it. Yeah, it does. You're right. It does have a 30K sensor in it. What it also has? A shit ton of RGB. It's 179 Canadian dollars because they put the good shit on the Pro version of this mouse. And the Pro version is not even that good. Like, if you compare the Pro version of the Razer Cobra to the HyperX Pulsefire Haste, smokes it out of the water. Even the wireless version of the Haste is arguably probably as good as the Razer Cobra Pro, maybe with the click latency, maybe not necessarily. But even like if you compare it to like a Pulsar X2, a Pulsar X Lite, all these other mice in the market are so much better. And the fact that Razer wants to charge 179 Canadian dollars. So if you want the actual usable experience, you have to buy the Pro edition, which is another part of this that makes me so upset because it's almost like Razer is intentionally releasing a bad product at the consumer baseline and saying, oh, well, the Razer Cobra is just not the highest tier and it's expected to be having issues with it. Unless you're buying a Razer branded mouse pad and a Razer Cobra Pro, you're not going to have the full experience, which is just mind numbing. It makes my head hurt so much because it's so frustrating because, again, I know that the Razer Cobra Pro is a dog mouse. I know it's bad, but consumers don't know that. And consumers are just going to buy whatever their kid likes or whatever they think is the best. And if it means they're going to buy a 179 Canadian dollar RGB mouse with terrible specs, then yeah, they're going to buy that. And that's the most frustrating part about this too, because again, at the end of the day, this is going to work. Razer killed off the Viper because the Viper did not have good consumer sales. They're trying to make as much money from this as possible. And it's going to work because people don't know, they don't educate themselves, and they just buy whatever the first mouse they see on the wall is. And Razer is a relatively household name. It's pretty much everywhere. People are gonna say, oh, a Razer mouse for 54 Canadian dollars. That's a great deal, son. You'll love this for playing Roblox. Like that's the thing. Like, it's gonna work too, and they're gonna make so much money off of this stuff. It's so frustrating, and it makes me so sad because Razer has had a history of up a lot of. And they were kind of on a good track when they released the Death Adder V3 because they were like, okay, the Death Adder V3 Pro came out. It was a disaster. Okay, let's fix it, release the Death Adder V3. And then they kill off the Viper. They isolate the Viper shape to the Viper Mini SE edition, which is like 275 Canadian dollars. And they say, oh, here's the Cobra and the Cobra Pro to replace this lineup, which is just a slap in the face. Anyways, I'm tired of ranting about this thing. It is what it is. It's going to make them a bunch of money, and it is what it is. It just really sucks to see from an enthusiast perspective. So many people get duped by Razer's marketing here because there's going to be so many people who are just going to have a really shit experience when there are just so many mice in the market that are so much better than this. Like the HyperX Pulsefire Haste 2 blows the Cobra out of the water, has just better overall specs, and has 4 and 8K pulling out of the box. Keychron M3 Mini, despite some of its flaws, is astronomically better than the Razer Cobra, and it's wireless and it's cheaper, which is just insane. At the end of the day, all we can do is just kind of spread the word about this mouse as much as possible, and hopefully consumers actually do a little bit of research research before they purchase the product and avoid this like the plague, because I would hate to see this mouse sell like absolute hotcakes and Razer continue to do this same consumer focused, very poor designed product. That's all I'm going to say about this. Thank you for watching. This is not earning the mel0n seal of approval. This is earning the mel0n tosses this into the garbage can at 100 miles per hour award, whatever the that is. This thing's a piece of shit. Do not buy this. If you see your family or someone you know trying to buy this mouse, or even the Cobra Pro, please do not let them buy this. Do them a favor. Friends don't let friends buy the Razer Cobra. Okay, just don't do it. Just don't do it. If you'd like to watch a video about an actual good budget mouse, you can check out my video on the Keychron M3 Mini and the HyperX Pulsefire Haze 2, both of which are very, very, very solid budget mice that will actually perform properly and give you a good experience. Thank you for watching me mauled about Razer's marketing and products for like 30 minutes. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll catch you guys in the next one, and hopefully it's not another Razer product, because I'm going to lose my mind at this point. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.